All right, good morning and welcome to the first class of Introduction to the Environmental Humanities. If you're here, you have a clue what the environmental humanities are, but also I like to start by saying that the environmental humanities is very much a journey, is very much an exploration, is not a very meticulously charted territory. This is something that has been done for how long? 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. We're going to analyze that, but also is very much a work in progress. So what I'm going to do today is to, of course, tell you a little bit about this class in the broader context of this master's degree, the first Italian master's degree in environmental humanities, and also mention a few of the topics that then will be explored more in depth during the following classes. Another general rule, feel free to raise your hand, interrupt, ask questions. Today I will repeat the questions, not because I'm kind of slow, but also for the purpose of the recording. But in general, I would like this to be very much of an interactive discussion, especially when we start reading the text, because this class is very much based on reading text. So today's class is divided into 4 parts. The first part is called diagnosis. The second part is called definitions. The third part is called genealogies. And the last part is called imaginaries. So why the environmental humanities? I've chosen a wonderful painting from the mid-19th century, Venice in the winter, Venice under the snow. Some of you are here in Venice for the first time, and so this is just to promise that there will be colder moments. But also a painting where a steamboat is puffing out smoke, is puffing out steam, is invading the space of sailboats, of ships that were occupying the artistic and the real scenario of Venice, and starting a process of polluting the atmosphere, of which we are at a dangerous end. So people who would normally look at this painting would probably say, oh, beautiful canals, beautiful paintings, beautiful buildings, the snow, the sky. So one concise way of introducing the environmental humanities is that we have to look at the center and we have to look at the smoke first. So now let's see how with all these 2 screens, you never know how to, sorry, I have to, up. No, you see. Okay, the first part, diagnosis. 10 August 2021, a month ago, this was the front page of the British newspaper, The Guardian. Wildfires were raging in a small Greek, actually they were raging everywhere in Greece. But this very eloquent picture was captured. An elderly Greek lady showing grief, distress, desperation, because her lovely place was going up in flames. And the large print headline reads, Global Climate Crisis, Inevitable, Unprecedented, and Irreversible. So what we need to start from, and I hope the reason why we're here is because we are in the midst of a global climate crisis that is inevitable. It's already there. It's unprecedented. Not true at all that, oh yes, there were fires and extreme weather events before. Yes, there were, but never under the present circumstances. And irreversible. Irreversible. The wildfires are just a symptom of the crisis. the frequent and increasingly frequent acqua alta, the flooding of the city of Venice that you will be experiencing or have already experienced, are a symptom. So we are dealing with a lot of symptoms, and we have, very important point for us, trust the scientists, the consensus of scientists that if we don't try to avoid a rise in the global temperature in the next decades, life on this planet will be impossible, or certainly nearly impossible, and there will be a lot of catastrophic consequences that we are going to experience, in particular on coastal cities like Venice. So I want to say from the very beginning that doing environmental humanities in Venice has at least a double significance. On the one hand, this is a vulnerable city. It's a fragile city. It's a city where you can actually see, live, literally wade through the climate crisis. But on the other hand, this is a city that for centuries has created an ecosystem that had a balance between human existence and its non-human components. And so we are uniquely positioned to feel the urgency of action, but also to capitalize on the tradition and the legacy of a city that has lived on the edge. We live on the edge. Being within the environmental humanities, if you want to have a slogan, if you want to have your next tattoo, that would be living on the edge. We live on the edge. The global climate crisis is a crisis in the atmosphere, in the landscape, in the air, but as one of our leading thinkers of the present age has stated, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture, and thus of the imagination. Environmental humanities means dealing with a crisis of culture and a crisis of the imagination. I would like to say quite openly that this degree was born because of Amitav Ghosh. His work has been our inspiration. He is an amazing thinker, and in early October, we are going to, albeit online, but we are going to host him and we'll have a chance to meet him. Last year, students from Ca' Foscari interviewed him, and you can find the interview online as part of the many resources we want to make available. The Great Derangement, the book published in 2016, from which this quote is taken, is, of course, the book that we are going to read starting as early as next week. For next week, homework, that's the news for you. I'm going to assign homework every week. For next week, please do read the first section of The Great Derangement. Amitav Ghosh also offers, of course, an extended diagnosis of the present moment, and this is perhaps the quote that prompted us to rethink the way in which we teach the global crisis at Ca' Foscari. He imagines that 20 years from now, when the world will be a warmer, a hotter place, the sea will be higher, you'll be my age, and hopefully you'll have children that you will be able to raise in a livable world. So 20 years from now, Ghosh says, people will look back and says, well, in the early 21st century, the scientific information, the analysis of the global climate crisis was already there, so obviously everybody was thinking about it. not only the scientists, the economists, the politicians, but clearly there was such a planetary phenomenon, a pervasive phenomenon, that obviously every novelist, every painter, every filmmaker was thinking about it. But when they fail to find them, he says, when 20 years from now people will look back and will see, you know what, there's a lot of art produced today that is not dealing with this. They say they will conclude that ours was a time when most forms of art and literature were drawn into the modes of concealment, to conceal, to hide. Present-day culture is hiding the seriousness of the situation. And his conclusion is that we need a new definition of our time, the Great Derangement. Interestingly enough, in Italian, that book, that wonderful book, was beautifully translated, but with a title that is not literal. The title in Italian is La Grande Cecità, the Great Blindness, which is, a form of concealment, but derangement means to be totally insane. So we are insane, Ghosh says. Why do we conceal? Are we insane? Are we crazy? Are we stupid? No. And here, I think we need some tools from psychoanalysis. Environmental humanities is a big toolbox that contains many tools from different disciplines. So, you all come from different backgrounds. So one thing you need to accept is that there were moments where you will be extremely bored by what I say and what other people say because you know already those tools. But other times you will feel, oh, I didn't do chemistry in school, things like that. So our big challenge is also to understand that we all bring a different background to this shared enterprise, and we'll try to combine. I'll use a lot of different metaphors. Toolbox is one, but then it's also a kind of jigsaw puzzle where we try to put the things together, a textile where we try to weave different threads together. Anyway, this is a picture from roughly 100 years ago when the San Marco Campanile, the bell tower, came down, famously killing only one cat. This is what the legend says. There is a fake picture that circulates that captures the moment where the Campanile is coming down, which of course could not have been done because iPhones were not, around there. But I've chosen this picture for two reasons. Why? Because we see a scene of disaster. And we are, in a way, living in an age that has multiple scenes of disasters in front of us. And then we see a big group of people who have gone to Piazza San Marco, as I'm sure you will be going or already have gone, to see the site of the disaster. Because disasters are actually appealing. There is a kind of pornography of disasters. When there are car accidents, people slow down to see what's going on. And this is. So this picture also captures a moment that was witnessed by a man from Vienna called Sigmund Freud, who traveled to Venice multiple times, who was in fact in love with Venice, and he has contributed fundamental ideas to our culture. And a psychoanalyst, present-day psychoanalyst called Sally Weintraub, and you can find her online website there, has come up with what I think is a very important set of definitions that explain why we are, as Ghosh says, concealing the truth. And she argues that there are three types of concealment, as Ghosh says: denialism, negation, and disavowal. Denialism is misinformation. The people who says climate change does not exist. There were always colder times, there were always ice ages, there were always moments where the planet was hot, so forget this. So people who really contrast the consensus of scientists, especially the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, that is the large international agency that has concluded that we are in trouble. So there are also agents who, in different ways, spread misinformation, try to play down the reality of climate change, especially because they have commercial or political interests. The former president of the United States of America was perhaps one of the best-known examples, someone who would also at least flirt with this type of denial. That doesn't mean that if you sort of challenge certain conclusions, you are a negationist. Let me say that. Of course, it's not that we have to accept science as scientists themselves would say that science is something that is there to be falsified, to be challenged. But when people say that the fires in Greece are there just because Greece is hot and Prometheus may have had, overslept, this is, of course, a type of denialism. But denialism is not the most dangerous phenomenon. The two most dangerous phenomena are negation and disavowal. Negation is when you know that climate change is true, but you deny it. This is a very well-known psychological phenomenon when you don't want to accept, you cannot bring yourself to accept an unbearable truth. Typically, when some people suffer the death of someone they love, there is a moment where they say, this is not true. It's a defense mechanism. So another provisional definition I would offer, the environmental humanities are trying to fight or also to work with defense mechanisms. Because most people, I would say, the majority of people are not climate deniers. Majority of people are people who enact some sort of defense mechanism. We ourselves will have to deal with these mechanisms. Disavowal, number 3, is a minor form of defense mechanism, but is the one that is used by probably even many of us. The overwhelming majority of people who have access to the information, which means that you know that if we continue to eat red meat, the planet is going to explode. But then you say, all right, but that cheeseburger at my favorite joint will not make a difference, and I'll go and I'll indulge myself. And so we minimize the vastity. Otherwise, we would lose our sleep. And so another function of the environmental humanities is also to have cultural forms that help us to live with this big burden. And so I'd like to say that who are we in that picture? We are the workers on the margins that are working with the rubbles, that are trying even to do something for the spectators or the audience. We are not afraid of getting our hands dirty, to picking up the pieces, and to build something new. This sounds very ambitious, but that's what we should aim at. Any questions, observation, remark? For those of you who are at home, again, I invite you maybe for the time being to use the chat if you have some questions or remarks, and I'll try to address it as much as possible. So this is the diagnosis. That's where we are. Now let's see what we can do and how the environmental humanities are defined. Part 2, definitions. First of all, translation. How do we translate environmental humanities across cultures and languages? Anyone here speaking Japanese or Russian? Okay. So the official Italian translation for environmental humanities was provided recently by one of the leading scholars of the environmental humanities, someone that we are going to read from, Serenella Iovino, who is also going to be our guest. And she and Marco Armiero, who is the other great Italian scholar of the field, he's an environmental historian, she's more of a literature and philosophy scholar, have provided a new entry for the Encyclopedia Treccani. Treccani is the most authoritative encyclopedia and also a fairly conservative one. So it's quite interesting that Treccani, under the entry Ambiente, environment, has in fact included the environmental humanities and translated them as Scienze umane per l'ambiente. Human sciences, humanities for the environment. I used to say Scienze umane ambientali. Okay. Now, Geisteswissenschaften, that's the German translation. Humanidades ambientales in Spanish. And in Japanese, anyone here? I think we have actually a Japanese student. But anyway, so you please, can you quickly just pull it? Okay. All right, thank you. What about here for the Russian definition? There is a literal translation, but can anyone pronounce it for us? Please. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so this is just to say that these are definitions you can find in different places. Sometimes you find ecological humanities as an alternative definitions. We in Venice discussed quite extensively about how to name the program, and we finally opted for this because it was the most recognized definition. As all definition, it has its limitation. It has, in fact, its downsides, and in fact, we could say that environmental humanities is almost an contradiction in terms. I'll tell you why. Whoops, sorry, it's a lot of clicking that has to be done here. I see, by the way, that Annalise is also tell us that in Brazilian Portuguese is Humanidades Ambientais. Again, sorry, Annalise, for the pronunciation, but we see that it's close enough to Spanish. So the question is, if we use environmental humanities, we use the word environment and we use the word humanities. Philology is going to be a big ally of ours. Philology seems to be the more abstract, the most self-serving discipline, but in fact it's very important because to work on the crisis of culture and the imagination, we need to work a lot on our language. We need to change our language. We need to become more self-conscious about our language. So the word environment is one of the many words that have entered the English language from French. And the Oxford English Dictionary, the Bible of the English language, is a great resource because it tells us when a certain word is used for the first time, or at least appears in print for the first time. And so we learn here that the word environment appears for the first time in 1603 in a translation of Plutarch, so in a translation of the classics, typical example of humanities. The humanities, we're going to deal with the humanities in a few minutes. And initially, it has nothing to do with, let's say, the modern, let's say, more ecological version of it. It seems simply something that is around us. Okay? And in fact, even at a later stage, the meaning number 2, environment, means the area surrounding a place or a thing. I dintorni, what is around us. Now, why is this a problematic definition to begin with? Because when environment becomes finally the physical surroundings or conditions in which a person or other organism lives, we are in the mid-19th century. So it takes 250 years for the word environment to become simply, let's say, a topographical element to become more like a physical, natural element. We are in the midst of a very important scientific century, but we're also in the midst of the beginning of the crisis. And environment, why I said that is a contradiction in terms, because environment describes the world as centering around the human being, which is in the environment. So to say that there is an environment means that the center of that environment is the person or the human species that is between us. So this is, I would say, an anthropocentric definition. A tree or a bird or a river or a germ doesn't think in terms, oh, I live around human beings. But this is the way in which we use the word. And I think it's no accident that the first definition of environment in the mid-19th century coincides with what I consider the most, what science considers perhaps the most dramatic and important revolution in science. So the work of Charles Darwin and the complete revolution in positioning human beings in the West vis-a-vis history, geography, evolution. And just one last mention of the, when you see frequently with the environment is almost made a noun, it also becomes an entity, the environment, and we are in the mid-20th century. That's where modern ecological consciousness arises, and people start becoming aware that the environment is what is being, in a way, jeopardized by humans. So by saying environmental humanities, we put the environment at the center of our thinking, and at the same time we need to change that, because the environment cannot be that which exists to be around humans. We need to move beyond this anthropocentric perspective, even though we are, anthropoi. And you see that the last mention of the Oxford English Dictionary 2007 from The Guardian, the greater the energy use, the greater the carbon footprint, and the worse for the environment a product is. So that linguistic entry, maybe future scholars will see it as one of the clues provided. So we see how the history of a word becomes the history of a concept, but also the history of a whole era. What about the humanities? So funny that the humanities have one of their hotspots in Italy, but we don't really have a good translation for humanities, or at least in a single word. We don't use scienze umane, for sure. We say cultura umanistica. We have a department here of studi umanistici. Traditionally, humanities means Greek and Latin. In the Italian educational system, very early on, you have to decide whether you want to go to a more scientific-oriented high school, liceo scientifico, or a language-oriented high school, liceo linguistico, or usually the top in the cultural and symbolic capital ranking is liceo classico. And that's where you have Latin and Greek. And this is called Studia Humanitatis, because they're also connected to a historic phenomenon called Umanesimo, that starting, some people say in the 14th century, 15th century, depending how you look at it, but it was the rediscovery of classical antiquity, especially Greek text, by Western Europe. People like Petrarch, is connected to that, to think of Venetian connection. Interestingly, again, the Oxford English Dictionary reminds us that humanities is also born in a sort of dialectical relationship with theology, with the study of God, so as separated from religion. So let me offer you a provocative definition. The humanities are considered typically like a site of high learning, of great wisdom, of the celebration of the highest achievements of human beings in the West, but the humanities are also a site of separation, where things are separated, and also where that separation has had, I would say, a very pernicious effect on our way of understanding culture. Because Leonardo da Vinci was a great humanist, was in fact, by modern terms, both a humanist, a scientist, an engineer. He was really an all-round intellectual who managed different branches of living. We wish we could have a Leonardo today to deal with the global crisis. Leonardo, of course, had less material to access. People in the age of Leonardo could read almost everything written about physics, or everything written because the library back then were a bit shorter. Today, one can spend their entire life reading only essays on Hamlet. So specialization, hyper-specialization, is one of the problems we have, and I applaud the fact that you're here, because if you're here, you have accepted the challenge of not becoming real specialists in any traditional discipline. So when you go to parties, you'll find a chemist that will tell you, oh, you don't know enough chemistry. You'll find a philosopher that will tell you don't know about chemistry. So you'll have to go, move around the room. But hopefully one day, this will be almost recognized as something that was necessary, precisely because it wasn't hyper-specialized. Because the climate crisis, in a way, thrives on hyper-specialization. No real specialist alone can address the crisis. And I would add something else. I think that hyper-specialization is another form of disavowal. If I concentrate entirely on my own branch, this is also a way of saying, I'm doing my job, and then I can ignore the ways in which other sectors of life are affected. I'm not an enemy of specialization. I think we need the specialist. For sure, I hope, I pray, I long for oceanographers to continue to work. But I think that every discipline has a history and needs to expand. And I'm very excited because the Environmental Humanities program could start here, because there were many people who were doing already the environmental humanities without knowing it. There were many scientists who were doing environmental science and had an interest in other ways, in other disciplines dealing with the environment. There were scholars of literature that were doing with ecology. So our lack and our intuition was to bring them all together in a room and discover that we could do something new. And you are, here because you have accepted that challenge. So the environmental humanities is trying to bridge the gap between historically separated branches of knowledge. First of all, nature disciplines and culture disciplines, the sciences and the humanities, but also, as we're going to see, secular versus theological, especially in Italy, because Italy is a country with an overwhelming Catholic majority, where, and this will be new information for some of our international students, the word religion sometimes is used as a synonym for Catholicism, like in school, where we have religione as a discipline, which means Catholicism. That separation that was created in the Italian educational system to protect, to create a secular Italy versus the influence of the church, has also, in a way, created a side effect whereby we don't consider the fact that religion is very important to understand, conceptualize, experience our relationship with the environment. We're going to see that in order to understand how we deal with nature today, we have to read the Bible. And the last separation, among many, is the one that our degree addresses, I would say, in a very unique way. The separation between West and the rest. Science is so much embedded in the history of European thought. What our degree offers is also an introduction to how the relation with the environment is envisioned in other cultures, in China, in India, in Japan, and to have a cross-cultural, a comparative understanding of what other cultures define as nature, the environment, is key to address the crisis of the imagination. And I think it is no accident that our intellectual, I would say, leader, Amitav Ghosh, is someone who has that broad, multicultural and multilinguistic background. So, environmental humanities is like a temporary definition, is one that also we need to explain to our grandfather and grandmother. Maybe some of you were asked by your grandpa or grandma, what are you studying? And you say, environmental humanities. What? And so this is Wikipedia. And Wikipedia, we're not going to read that, but it's interesting, it really places an emphasis on the interdisciplinarity of this. We are interdisciplinary. And as I've just mentioned, it also stresses how it aimed to help bridge traditional divides between sciences and the humanities, Western, Eastern, and indigenous ways of relating to the natural world. I want to make an aside here. And the aside is important because I think the environmental humanities also harbors another possible contradiction. The contradiction is that precisely because we know that the situation is serious, is urgent, we would like to act now. We would like to do something, to have an impact. And on the other hand, we're here dealing with the history of a word. We are trying to focus on arcane, philological, disciplinary enigmas, conundrums. Well, I think, yes, we need to accept this ambivalence. Because I think if we need to, let's say, transform our imagination, we have also to have a certain degree of patience. So we may be impatient to act. We may find, and I hope we are going to find, forms of action that are immediate. But simultaneously, I invite you to consider the importance of patient, slow, dedicated, critical thinking. Some of the changes that we're here for may take decades, may even be too slow, but I think they're necessary. We cannot possibly change or transform the imaginary overnight, unless you have some fantastic idea that, we're very welcome. Final definition, before we move to a third part. One is less a definition than a a prophecy that was made in 2017 by two American scholars that in their critical introduction to environmental humanities predict that 10 years from now, so if it was 10 years in 2017, would be like 5 years from now, the environmental humanities will likely be present in most universities. I don't think so, because the academic world is very slow, is very conservative. But now they claim they are articulating concerns relevant to medicine, animal rights, neurobiology, race and gender studies, urban planning, climate science, and digital technology. I think this is a useful definition because it lists some of the issues, some of the other areas in which there's going to be some overlapping. More generally, they emphasize humanists with environmental concerns are proving adept at communicating with a broad public. And I think that there is something both important and problematic. It's very important because, as we know, when some of the scientists speak and they use diagrams or graphs, people say, oh, the same with humanists, by the way. But we should not mistake the environmental humanities as science for dummies, climate science for people who were bad at science in school. It's not about watering down, diluting, simplifying, streamlining messages. That's a part. Next year, you're going to take a new class called Environmental Writing, which is about communication. Communication is essential. We see that a lot of forms of denial, disavowal, even negation happen through or because communication issues. But there is more than that. Environmental humanities sometimes can actually have complicated messages. Let me take the example of art. Right now, we have the Biennale of Architecture. If you go there, you're not an architect, you're not an urban planner, that's not easy stuff. And yet, when you see it, which I encourage you should do, you'll see that many of the current pavilions are focused on the environmental crisis. And sometimes a great painter or a video maker can do something that will not, in fact, explain anything, but will move something or will complicate something. So environmental humanities is really operating across the board with multiple languages. Some of that are simpler messages for wider audiences. But if it was that simple, maybe we would already have solved. There are already so many documentaries that tells us, or so many apocalyptic movies that show the Earth after the climate crisis. That hasn't really prevented most people from going to that joint to have their cheeseburger. So the work we have to do is far more complicated and needs to be very, very diverse. And now, a more technical definition by Serenella Jovino and a great Turkish scholar, Serpil Opperman. The fundamental argument fueling the research in environmental humanities is that urgent environmental problems, the stretch from the geological, the biological, are also essentially social and cultural issues deeply interwoven with economic and political agendas. And, as I've just said, demand solutions on different levels, on many dimensions. These dimensions include new environmental imaginaries. The word imaginary will be my last keyword for today. Formulating new discursive practices and making changes in economic and political structures. If you don't understand what discursive practices is, this is precisely the point. Because environmental humanities is also, to some extent, a technical language, a technical discourse that we'll have to familiarize ourselves with. The environmental humanities means among other things. On the one hand, revisiting words that we're very familiar with, defamiliarizing words such as nature and culture. So rethinking common language. On the other hand, it entails familiarizing ourselves with new words such as Anthropocene or ecocide that are not common. And so, since literary environmental humanities borrows from different disciplines, including and especially what is called critical theory and literary theory, we'll have to deal with it. So please be aware that we are going to learn some technicalities and that some of you will be more familiar with that if you come from the humanities, or not necessarily. So please feel free always to say, oh, don't ever feel, oh, I'll have to be silent because I don't understand that. Always let me know. Let's share what is not a shared language. We have to build a shared language, and I'm telling you now this will be one of the goals and the methods of this class. Each of you, at some point, working in groups, will be asked to work on specific keywords and to create a little lexicon of the environmental humanities for everybody. We'll see that we'll start from certain text. From the text, we'll go to concepts. From the concepts to keywords. And I'll ask small groups to meet, to do research, and say, all right, let's offer a short definition of Anthropocene for my grandmother, Anthropocene for my grandfather, something like that, okay? But also for the next students. Don't forget, you are the second group of students enrolling in this class. You are pioneers. Later, you're going to meet some of the first-year students. They're already there, so it seems that so far so good. But it's a work in progress. And whatever you can do to build, it's, I think, an important effort. An important effort that, little intermission here, will be made, I hope, more interesting because not only will you have a rich course offering, but there will be a lot of things to do outside of the classroom. In early October, we're going to have, for a week, an event called the Anthropocene Campus that will have a number of public events, and I hope that you can all be involved. And some of you may also be involved as interns, interacting with very important scholars, scientists, artists who will be coming to Venice from many different parts. Environmental imaginaries, working on the imaginary. Discursive practices, working on language, on the way in which we express things. And making changes in economic and political structures. The environmental humanities are not self-serving humanities, if ever there was such a thing. We are here to change things. We are here to change things in different levels, at different scales. So this is an eminently political degree. And if there's one word that I would put at the center of this enterprise, that's justice. Environmental justice, but environmental justice means also, and ultimately, social justice and justice for all organisms, all species on this planet. All of this we're going to see more in depth when we read Serenella Iovino when she's coming to lecture to us. Later this year, she will be coming to Venice as a visiting professor, so you can also take her class, and this will be a wonderful opportunity to learn from one of the great scholars in the field. Genealogies. Where do the environmental humanities come from? It's very important to know where they come from. There are many different ways of offering a genealogy. You know, we could start from, I don't know, I'm an English literature professor by training. We could start from romantic literature, poets, observing the clouds, walking among the flowers. But let's take a more narrow genealogy. What you are going to find is that there was a turning point when a book could change the environment. 1962, a woman who was never considered a full-fledged scientist or a full-fledged scholar because she was a woman in an eminently male world, published a book called Silent Spring that denounced, in a beautiful literary language, the use of pesticides in agriculture, making apparently agriculture more productive, but ultimately killing species and hurting irreversibly the environment. That book is credited for creating important new forms of environmental activism and also to the ban of DDT. It's so funny that when I was a kid, DDT was used also in everyday language to say you want to get rid of something, you use DDT. And my son doesn't have a clue about what DDT is. This is a change in the imaginary. We live, for better or for worse, in a more complex world. It would be my dream to write. Every ecologist's dreams is to write the next Silent Spring. A single book, and then you change something. A single book, and you solve the Aqua Alta problem. Things are, again, for better or for worse, in our digital age, in this information overload age, more complicated, and especially the humanities continue. And so cultural forms today are far more diverse and complex than with Silent Spring. But we have to pay our tribute to Rachel Carson and her Silent Spring book. Another word, and this perhaps is the first technical word, but many of you will be already familiar with it, is eco-criticism. So another important cultural site where awareness about nature originates is in literary studies. Literary studies start dealing with nature and environment and ecology in the 60s, in the 70s, and in the 70s and 80s, a word is coined that is eco-criticism. And in the early 90s, there was an important anthology called the Eco-Criticism Reader, where the two editors said something that, to me, was very, even upsetting, because I was, let's say, a young scholar coming of age in the early 90s, and I was focusing on the new great critical horizon that included race, gender, and class. All politically committed critics were focusing on race, gender, and class, and fighting valiantly more conservative critics that wanted to study literature and forms in a more self-referential form. And then on the margin, someone said, what about nature? And people like myself would think, who cares about the birds and the grass? We need to fight slavery and racism. And there was that, I would say, very regrettable moment where another separation was created. Because as we are going to see, racism and the environmental crisis are interlinked. Gender and the environmental crisis are interlinked. Since then, eco-criticism has joined hands with other forms of literary and philosophical and sociological thinking. So, just as an example, I've given you, covers of books that will tell you post-colonial eco-criticism. To me, just to spell it out, I was trained in post-colonialism, the study of the cultures and literature of the former British colonies. To me, post-colonialism and eco-criticism were almost separate things that at best concerns places like Canada and Australia that were very big and had strong interest and investment in the landscape. But I never thought of post-colonial and eco-criticism coming together in the canonical authors, like Amitav Ghosh. When I started reading and studying Amitav Ghosh was about history, about violence, about colonial wars. I never thought of Amitav Ghosh as linked to the environment. So it was thanks to him that I had that recognition. And I'm saying that because I recognize myself as a convert, as a neophyte, as someone who had that recognition, that shock of recognition later. Feminist eco-criticism. Feminism is the other great revolution that, as we are going to see, is strongly linked to eco-criticism. And Serenella Iovino, that you're going to hear mentioned several times, eco-criticism and Italy. Italy is a place that badly needs eco-criticism. Italy is world famous for its landscapes. Millions of people, hundreds of millions of people come to Italy from everywhere in the world to admire the beauties of our cities and landscapes, and we are destroying it slowly, gradually. And Venice is a case in point. And Venice is going to be not just a place where we're studying, but also an object of analysis for many of our considerations. Last but not least, after eco-criticism, in a way, broke away from the boundaries of literature or of philosophy, now we live in an era where we are producing a new terminology, even too much, in my humble opinion, where there's one word that we are going to discuss extensively in later classes, Anthropocene, that has been adopted to describe the fact that we have entered a new geological era that, unlike the previous one, is characterized by human intervention. Previous geological ages were defined by other agents, and humans were just a marginal presence there. The Anthropocene defines a moment where it is us, the anthropos, the human species, that has made what it is. And as soon as this definition was proposed in the early 2000s, that some people started questioning its validity. Because when we say that humans have destroyed the environment, does that equally apply to someone who runs a factory in Marghera and to a fisherman in Thailand? So is this really the anthropos writ large, or is it the capitalist? And so are we in the Anthropocene or in the Capitalocene? Or is this an era, as Marco Armiero points out, defines by waste? Are we in the Wastocene? Are we in the Cthulhucene, as Donna Haraway, a great American philosopher, argues that we have to live in an era of trouble? Are we in the Neganthropocene, as the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler says? Are we in the Anthropocene? This is the kind of thing that I would say is a risky game. This is where we risk, sort of splitting hairs. If a concept is good to revise our vision of things, that's good. If it becomes almost like a game, where one says, oh, I hope that I'll have the next great definition, we live in the... But I would say, let's live with this variety and complexity, and let's remind ourselves that one of our tasks will be to know when to use what type of language. There will be moments where we need to use certain words, and there will be moments where we need to translate them and to break them down in other types of language. There are other places where the environmental humanist is someone who takes her degree and is able to write a fantastic thesis where she discusses the implication of the meta theories of the Anthropocene qualifications of super technical. That's a very respectable career. Some of you will become maybe brilliant academics, but that's not our main task. Okay? So we'll have to recognize this language. We'll have to understand which is really helpful. And we'll have to understand when to use them. Where do we see this image almost every day? Okay, for the newcomers to Italy, the €1 coin has the Vitruvian Man on one side. Where is the original? Quiz. Free, I'll give you 3 options. Number 1, the Louvre, France. Number 2, the Uffizi, Florence. Number 3, the Galleria dell'Accademia, Venice. Number 4, the Metropolitan Museum, New York. Number 5, the Hermitage, Russia. Number 6, Dubai, a great museum. Don't laugh, there are beautiful museums. Actually, it's Abu Dhabi. So, how many people think that is, you can raise your hands from home if your camera is on. How many people think that the Vitruvian Man is at the Louvre, France? This is a game where you cannot abstain. You have to make a decision. Okay. No one thinks that, a lot of Leonardo is in France, by the way. He was in France. How many people think he's at the Uffizi? Okay, you all know it's in Venice, right? Okay. It's in Venice. Okay, it's in Venice. That was a lame quiz. It is in Venice. It's such an iconic image that no matter what Leonardo wanted it to be, it was part of an architecture treatise, but this image has become a kind of symbol of humanism. Rosi Braidotti, a great Italian-Australian philosopher, has used it to explain what's wrong with traditional humanism. Humanism is connected to the Renaissance. The Renaissance is still connected to what seems to be the highest achievement of Western culture. I don't know about your own education. In my education, the narrative, the standard narrative was that the Renaissance was a very important moment because that's where men, in a way, liberated themselves from the hegemony of theology, of God, and felt that he was the crowning achievement of creation, and that was the beginning of what we would call a kind of anthropocentric culture that has the individual at the center. Humanism in the Renaissance is the myth of the individual as a free man, as an autonomous man, as a free-thinking man, as a creative man. The problem is that it's always man. Man used as a synonym of human being. And as Rosi Braidotti reminds us, the Vitruvian Man is also white, a concept that was certainly not available to Leonardo, is European, is handsome, able-bodied, and has a lot of hair, which, and she also quips saying that of his sexuality nothing much can be guessed, and we know that Leonardo is, there's plenty of speculation about his sexuality. But perhaps the most important thing is that in our culture still, whenever there is a general abstract discussion about the human being, man is always man, is white, that's what we think of man. But there's something else about this man. This man is isolated, is beautifully enshrined, encased in this perfect geometric circle. So he's a man that is separated from the environment, dominates the environment, is the man that looks at the environment. Even though one could, in fact, even joke that if you look at it from different point, that looks also like a monster with 4 arms and 4 legs. And this is exactly the kind of parody and that this iconic image has invited. Not all men are like the Vitruvian man. But even these parodies do not capture the real issue. And the real issue is perhaps encapsulated in 1 or 2 words that I'm going to give you that is going to be one of our guiding images in the environmental humanities. These words are entanglement and enmesh. We are not beautiful, isolated human beings that in our perfect, harmonic, geometric bubble or sphere observe, command, and master the universe. We are creatures, member of a species whose existence is entangled with other species. Which is eminently ironical to say now that we're all wearing masks to separate ourselves from one of these other species that has entered so violently our lives, because most certainly we tampered with other species, animals, and provoking a spillover from that species towards our own. So what we need to do is to move beyond the idea of a human being that is separated, isolated from nature, from the environment, from non-human species. We are entangled. We are enmeshed. Where do other species begin? Even the Vitruvian man, as you're going to learn from another great member of our faculty, Roberta Raffaetta, do not begin outside. They begin here. Guess of how many species there are inside our stomach and entrails and how many consequences there are. We are not a species that is above other species. We have to rethink our relationship with other species and the non-human world. To do that, we need to change our imaginary. Part 4, last part of our introductory class. What is the imaginary? Imaginary exists as an adjective in English, like in Italian, which means something that is fictional, like an imaginary friend. It's close to imagination. There are philosophical discussions about the relationship between imagination and imaginary. Imaginary is not something fictional. Or rather, the word imaginary as a noun describes our individual and collective way to envision things. Okay? Now, let's do a thought experiment. Now, I want all of you to close your eyes, and think of nature, okay? Think of nature. Okay, 5 seconds. Now, random, I hope I can ask a few people at home to write in 2 lines what they have pictured in their minds. And I also want to hear from here, a few people tell me, and you can briefly unmask yourselves, raise your hand, tell me what you picture in your mind. Yes?
I started with a field, some trees, a bird, and a stream, and then I felt guilty for forgetting the lizards in the city.
Okay, so I said you started by a field, birds, and a stream, and then you felt guilty because of the lack of, you didn't think of the lizards? Okay. The town and the city. Okay. Very quick imaginary. Thank you very much. Right, that's good. But yeah. Who else? Come on. Yes. Mountains and alpine refugees. Okay, good. You see that, very politically conscious,
And when I think about nature, I think like an explosion of colors and trees.
explosion of colors, trees. Okay,
Life and death also.
life and okay, but don't. Let's not get too abstract here because Okay. Let's see if someone has put anything. Ooh, okay. Let me read some from the chat. Of course, mountains, trees, green color, says Luca. Mountains, says Agnese. Benjamin says, scenes where you zoom in from the atmosphere to the bottom of the oceans. A huge forest, plants and animals. Life, trees, water, animals. Yes, okay. Waterfalls, lush forest, lots of green. Waterfalls, lush forest, lots of green, says Melissa. And this is, if you Google the word nature on Google Images, of course I'm not saying that Melissa lacks imagination, but this very little experiment shows that when we think about such a complex word such as nature, no one thought about diarrhea, no one thought about gangrene, no one thought about cancer, no one thought about even people. We all think of outdoor spaces, green. Most people said mountains or trees and forest. No one mentioned, this is just an experiment, so maybe no one mentioned, for instance, the sea. It's so interesting that another kind of analysis we're going to make is that the environmental humanities are still so much connected with the green and not with the blue. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of known human life on the planet is actually part of the watery sides, the ocean. And this also gives me the opportunity to say that we are going to be partnering with Ocean Space. That is a fantastic art institution based in Venice, fully devoted to art and the ocean. So we see this is a very simple, even naive, and thank you for playing with us, about how we think that we have a very individual imagination, but we all inhabit and are inhabited by a collective imaginary that comes from our cultural traditions. I love this image. This image to me, if there were no copyright issues, I hope there would be no copyright issues in the screening, I would use that as our icon for the environmental humanities. This is, I think, the first entry in the Google image search for nature that doesn't show a waterfall or a tree. By the way, if you Google nature, no human beings, which is so interesting. So human beings, in fact, the way we conceptualize nature, unless we feel guilty or have a political consciousness, we edit out human presence. Because, in fact, the first conceptualization of nature were about getting away from the realm of culture, getting away from the city, going away to faraway places to meditate. That's another tradition of ecology. What is this? This is a promise of real nature. This is a can of pet food for adult food that mixes bovine and pork to feed your adult dog. Don't feed it to the small dogs. What do you see there? How do you read this image? Oh, by the way, it's Italienischen Schinken. It's Italian pork. So it's, you're bringing your dog to an Italian restaurant, not. What do you make of this? Is this in any way problematic for you?
It's kind of greenwashing.
It's kind of greenwashing. Greenwashing is a very interesting definition that we're going to explore. Why is this greenwashing?
Because there are some color and words that make you think that it's pure.
Okay, sorry, I have to echo your words for the sake of the recording. You think there are some words and some images that convey the message, make you think that this is some sort of pure, ecologically, I would say, sustainable product.
Also the logo.
The logo, yes. This is, kind of, supposed to be. It says it's natürlich, it's natural, and it's also conveys the idea that it is absolutely natural to kill certain animals, and probably to use the discards. The owner has the rib stack, the famous cheeseburger, and the dog gets the discard parts.
I actually wouldn't have thought of that if you didn't say that, but the color, green color, also echoes the words real nature, because it's green.
Green, absolutely. Imaginary is a combination of the verbal and the visual, and also it's supposed to trigger certain emotions, reminiscences. I grew up at a time where natural was almost a bad word. You wanted something as artificial as possible. You badly wanted food that was blue. You wanted ice cream that was glowing in the dark. Because I came of age in a moment of industrialized food where we didn't want to really have anything natural. You didn't want to have apples with bumps or black spots. You really want something perfect. You wanted your snack to be filled with all sorts of colorants. You really want something that was terrible. God knows what I ate in my childhood. And then there was a moment where marketing and the industry discovered that people wanted to rediscover the roots that had been uprooted. Italians will know that the most iconic brand from the 80s on, and still one of the most popular brand, is called Mulino Bianco, the white mill, which recreated the fantasy that the cookies, the pasta, the bread was not made in a big industry outside of Gallarate, Milan, but it was, made manually in a small white mill by a river, where you didn't, on the other hand, see the brother of the miller slaughtering the goat and with all the washing the hands with in the blood, because nature is cultural. Our representation of nature is nature. Nature is the way we represent it. And we live now in this moment where everyone goes out of their way to demonstrate that what they do is natural. This product is real nature. I think there's something ironical, because I think that they are really actually very honest. You would say the real nature of man is to kill animals and to feed on animals. The real nature of man is to try to sell things to other humans. I'm always so suspicious of the use of the word human, because human can mean so many different things, bad or good. But the fact is that this cannot be, from a different perspective, real nature, for the very simple reason that if we continue to kill cows to eat, these cows in particular are going to fart us to death. The emission of carbon dioxide by cows exceeds that of cars. And I'm not a vegetarian. I'm struggling with it. I'm working on it, but I'm not. But I understand. This is my own part of disavowal. But I know that consciously, I look at my son and I says, well, if I want him to be able to enjoy a good meal, that has to change. Or maybe, paradoxically, only my dog, who may not like tofu, will be allowed to eat certain types of meat, because that's real nature, maybe. In real nature, the leopard kills the gazelle and things like that. But if we continue to kill cows and pork and to can them and to feed them to our children, to our dogs, we're screwed. But that happens because we feed our imaginary with this idea that I'm opening this can and it's a work of real nature. It's natural. Bœuf au jambon italien. My goodness, you know. And I want to end by looking also at the imaginary of Venice, because as I said, if we want to operate on the imaginary, we have a perfect test case here in Venice. Venice is one of the most represented cities in the world. There are representations of cities of Venice everywhere. And Venice is used a lot in the modern world to understand the climate crisis. Acqua Alta, the COVID, you know, these are all things that were also seen through the mirror, the lens of Venice. During the COVID, there were so many, I mean, some of you decided to come here because you saw the empty city without tourists. Or you saw these beautiful pictures of flamingos and dolphins and crocodiles and leviathans swimming in the crystal clear waters of the lagoon. Venice is a city that has invited the exercise of the imaginary. We don't have time, but if you look at this picture, it shows Venice represented, this is after the terrible flooding of 2019, as a beautiful but slightly sickly, pale woman dressed in black, like she's going to her own funeral, that holds her gravestone or a kind of Flintstone credit card saying, "Protect Venice, donate." So the message that is carried across is give money, protect this beautiful city, save the city. This is the rhetoric that is killing the city. Yes, we may get some money, but if we don't rethink Venice as this thing, a city of life, education, science, a laboratory to analyze, correct the environmental crisis, Venice is really going to die. If we think of Venice as a patient that only needs to be on life support by channeling money, sitting, of course, on the ubiquitous gondola, we are really damned. The very last image is to introduce the fact that I've mentioned Amitav Ghosh, who will be our first reading and our first guide. So the first 3 weeks we are going to read The Great Derangement. I've already mentioned several times Serenella Iovino, the other scholar. But the real experiment we're going to do is to stay with one of the great Italian writers of all times, Primo Levi, survivor of the death camp of Auschwitz, the author of some seminal books like If This Is a Man or The Drowned and the Saved. But I've chosen Primo Levi for two reasons. One is because he was one of the few great European writers who was a scientist by training. He was a chemist, and the periodic table is a book that is divided by chapters named after the elements of the periodic table. Secondly, because, as I said before, justice is the key, the heart of the environmental humanities, and if there is a writer who has profoundly meditated on justice, that's him. Because he's a great writer, and last but not least, because I want to show you and to learn with you that environmental humanities is not about reading texts that are self-consciously about nature, self-consciously about ecology. We have to reread our entire canon of the arts, of letters. And so I've chosen Primo Levi because I want to reread Primo Levi with you from the point of view of the environmental humanities. Every chapter, and as I have reread it, it was such a fantastic surprise because there's so much in it that provides food for thought and will enable us to discuss all the key concepts of the environmental humanities. As an exercise, please think about your favorite book ever. And when you have the time, reread it and reread it for the environment. Let's see what happens. So this is the end. Thank you for your presence here. Thank you for your presence at home. Welcome to Environmental Humanities. Ka Foscari, and see you.